It was a warm summer afternoon on January 9th, 2020, when chaos erupted in the Melbourne suburb of Epping. The usually quiet streets were shattered by the echo of gunfire, leaving residents scrambling for cover and commuters frozen in shock. The target of the attack, Nabil Maghnie, better known as the Mad Leb, a figure who had long dominated Melbourne's criminal underworld. The shooting unfolded in broad daylight outside a busy shopping area, a bold and dangerous move that signaled this was no random act of violence. Witnesses later described seeing a black vehicle speeding away from the scene, its tires screeching against the asphalt. Yet when police arrived, they were met with silence. Many who had been nearby either refused to speak or claimed they hadn't seen anything. Maghnie lay slumped over, fatally wounded by multiple gunshots. The brutality of the act was evident, as was its precision. This was a calculated hit designed to send a message. To those familiar with Maghnie's violent history and extensive list of enemies, his murder wasn't entirely unexpected. What stunned both law enforcement and the public, however, was the audacity of the execution. Melbourne had seen gangland killings before, but few had been as brazen as this. In the hours that followed, the scene was cordoned off, and investigators meticulously combed the area for evidence. Shell casings were collected, security footage was reviewed, and witness statements were taken. Yet, despite the public nature of the crime, leads were scarce. The silence of the streets, steeped in the underworld's unwritten code, only deepened the mystery. As the sun set on that fateful day, Melbourne's criminal landscape shifted irrevocably. The murder of Nabil Maghnie wasn't just the end of a notorious figure, it was the beginning of a puzzle that would baffle investigators for years to come. To understand the significance of Maghnie's murder, we must first understand the man himself, a complex and polarizing figure who inspired both fear and loyalty. Born and raised in Melbourne, Nabil Maghnie's life was shaped by the harsh realities of his environment. From a young age, he became immersed in the city's criminal underworld, climbing its ranks with ruthless efficiency. Maghnie wasn't just a foot soldier in Melbourne's gang scene, he was a leader, a man who commanded respect through sheer force of will and violence. He earned his infamous nickname, Mad Leb, due to his volatile temper and Lebanese heritage, a combination that made him both unpredictable and dangerous. Central to his rise was his role as a debt collector. Unlike others in his line of work, Maghnie operated with a level of brutality that set him apart. He was known to use intimidation, physical violence, and even threats against families to ensure debts were paid. For many, the mere mention of his name was enough to inspire fear. Maghnie's reputation extended beyond his own activities, largely due to his close ties with the Comanchero Bikie gang, one of Australia's most feared organized crime groups. The Comancheros, notorious for their involvement in drug trafficking, extortion, and violent turf wars, provided Maghnie with protection and a network of like-minded individuals. In return, Maghnie acted as an enforcer and ally, further solidifying his position in Melbourne's underworld. Despite his fearsome reputation, Maghnie's life wasn't without contradictions. He was described by those close to him as fiercely loyal to his family, particularly his children. This duality, being both a ruthless criminal and a devoted father, painted a complex picture of a man who was as much a product of his environment as he was a creator of it. But what drove Maghnie to embrace a life of crime so completely? Was it the pursuit of power, the allure of wealth, or a need to survive in a harsh world? These questions linger, even as we examine the events that ultimately led to his violent end. One thing is clear. Nabil Maghnie wasn't just a criminal, he was a symbol of Melbourne's shadowy underworld, a man whose death would send shockwaves through both the city's streets and its corridors of power. Life in Melbourne's criminal underworld was not dictated by written laws, but by an unspoken ironclad code. For Nabil Maghnie, this code was both a shield and a noose. It was a world where silence wasn't just respected, it was demanded. To speak out was to invite retaliation, often swift and brutal. Loyalty was the highest currency, a bond that could mean the difference between life and death. Betrayal, however, was the ultimate sin, punishable by violent retribution. Maghnie's survival in this shadowy world depended on his ability to navigate these unwritten rules. His alliances with powerful figures like the Comanchero Bikie gang ensured his dominance, but they also came with risks. Trust was fragile, and even a perceived slight could spark deadly consequences. For law enforcement, this code presented an almost insurmountable challenge. Witnesses who might have seen Maghnie's murder were bound by fear and loyalty to their own circles. Even those who despised him wouldn't dare risk speaking out, knowing the price of disloyalty was often paid in blood. This culture of silence left investigators grasping at shadows. Every step forward seemed to lead to a dead end, every potential lead silenced by the same unyielding rules that had governed Maghnie's life. The very code that had allowed him to thrive now served as a barrier to uncovering the truth about his death. Though Maghnie was a hardened criminal, there was one aspect of his life where his emotions often ran raw: his role as a father. In the months leading up to his death, a seemingly trivial incident involving his daughter spiraled into a deadly feud. It began with a minor car accident, an everyday mishap that should have been easily resolved. But for Maghnie, it wasn't about the damage or the money, it was about respect. The other party, reportedly unwilling to offer compensation, ignited a firestorm. To Maghnie, this wasn't just an insult, it was a direct challenge to his authority, both as a father and as a man of power. He demanded reparation, escalating the situation far beyond what most would consider reasonable. Friends and associates later described his obsession with the issue, noting how it consumed him in the weeks before his murder. Was this an overreaction born out of pride, or did Maghnie see it as a test of his influence in the criminal world? The feud over the accident may have seemed minor, but in the high-stakes realm of organized crime, even small slights could have devastating consequences. Maghnie's insistence on compensation may have offended someone powerful, someone who saw his demands as a threat to their own standing. Could this personal vendetta have marked the beginning of the end for the Mad Leb? January 9th, 2020 dawned like any other day for Nabil Maghnie. To those around him, he appeared calm and composed, conducting his business as usual. Surveillance cameras captured him moving through the streets of Melbourne, visiting familiar spots, meeting associates, and exuding the air of a man untouchable in his domain. But beneath the surface, danger was brewing. Unknown to Maghnie, he was being followed. His every move was being watched not by allies, but by his killers. Investigators later pieced together his final hours. He visited a cafe, made phone calls, and stopped by a mechanic's shop, routine activities that gave no hint of the storm that was about to break. At one point, he appeared to notice something unusual, glancing over his shoulder more than once. Did he sense the threat looming, or was his paranoia simply a product of the violent world he lived in? As the day wore on, Maghnie returned to Epping, a suburb he frequented. Witnesses would later recall seeing him standing near a parked car, his expression calm yet watchful. Moments later, the calm was shattered by the sound of gunfire. For Maghnie, it was a day like no other, a day when the hunter became the hunted. For Melbourne, it was a day that would be etched into the city's dark history, leaving behind more questions than answers. The attack on Nabil Maghnie was as swift as it was deliberate. It happened in a matter of seconds, leaving no room for escape. Witnesses reported hearing multiple gunshots before seeing two men flee the scene. Their faces were obscured, their movements precise. They knew exactly what they were doing, and it was clear this was no random act of violence. Maghnie's death wasn't merely a killing. It was a spectacle, a deliberate and chilling message sent to those who knew him. the nature of the attack daylight in a public place was designed to make a statement. But what was that statement, and who was it directed toward? Investigators quickly theorized that the murder was part of an ongoing power struggle within Melbourne's criminal underworld, but the specifics remained elusive. Was this a warning to Maghnie's associates, a punishment for overstepping boundaries, or an act of revenge for past transgressions? The execution style killing bore the hallmarks of a professional hit, yet the brazenness of the attack left many wondering if it was personal. For Maghnie, there was no chance to fight back, no opportunity to strike a deal, only the cold finality of his assassin's bullets. To understand the significance of Maghnie's murder, one must look at his history, a life steeped in violence and survival against all odds. He was no stranger to danger, having faced and survived multiple assassination attempts in the past. Just 1 year prior, Maghnie narrowly escaped death after being shot in the head during another targeted attack. He survived the injury, a feat that only added to his mythos within Melbourne's underworld. For many, his survival seemed almost supernatural, a testament to his resilience and the fear he inspired. But surviving the streets came at a cost. Each attack on Maghnie only deepened the blood feud between him and his enemies. His ability to evade death made him both a legend and a target. The more he survived, the more determined his adversaries became to finish the job. By the time of his death, Maghnie had become a lightning rod for violence. His reputation ensured that his name was etched on many hit lists, but it also meant that whoever succeeded in killing him would instantly make waves in the criminal world. This time, however, his luck ran out. The Mad Leb had lived by the sword, and in the end, he died by it. Central to the investigation into Maghnie's murder were his deep ties to the Comanchero Bikie gang, one of Australia's most notorious organized crime groups. The Comancheros were synonymous with violence, power, and control, dominating Melbourne's criminal landscape through drug trafficking, extortion, and relentless turf wars. Maghnie wasn't just an associate, he was a trusted ally and enforcer. His relationship with the gang gave him access to resources and protection, but also made him a high-profile target. The Comanchero name alone attracted countless enemies, and Maghnie's involvement only escalated those rivalries. Police theorized that Maghnie's murder could have been the result of an internal betrayal. In the world of organized crime, loyalty was often fragile, and shifting alliances could turn friends into foes overnight. Was Maghnie's growing influence within the gang perceived as a threat by other members, or had he crossed a line that the Comancheros themselves could not tolerate? Another possibility was that the attack was orchestrated by a rival gang seeking to weaken the Comancheros by eliminating one of their key figures. Maghnie's death wasn't just a personal loss. It was a blow to the gang's reputation and a stark reminder that no one, not even the Mad Leb, was untouchable. As investigators delved deeper, the web of alliances, betrayals, and rivalries surrounding Maghnie's life only grew more tangled. His murder wasn't just about him, it was a reflection of the volatile and dangerous world he inhabited. Whether the Comancheros had a hand in his death or were simply unable to protect him, one thing was certain: the ripples of his murder would be felt throughout Melbourne's underworld for years to come. Nabil Maghnie's life of crime wasn't just one of dominance, it was one of constant conflict. His rise to power left a trail of destruction in its wake, unpaid debts, bruised egos, and vendettas that simmered for years. For every associate who relied on Maghnie's protection or shared in his spoils, there were countless others who seethed at his name. Law enforcement was immediately overwhelmed by the sheer number of potential suspects. Maghnie's enemies ranged from rival gangs to former allies who felt betrayed or wronged by him. Even within his own circle, loyalty was often fleeting and grudges could linger in the shadows. One of the most significant challenges for investigators was determining who had the strongest motive. Was it someone he had recently humiliated during a debt collection, a rival gang leader looking to assert dominance, or perhaps a former ally turned enemy after a falling out? The possibilities were endless, and each suspect seemed as plausible as the last. Complicating matters further was the lack of solid evidence. While Maghnie had no shortage of enemies, no one left behind the kind of clues that could tie them definitively to the murder. The more police uncovered about Maghnie's criminal dealings, the more tangled the web became. When the gunshots echoed through Epping on January 9, 2020, the streets were far from empty. Several witnesses saw or heard the events unfold, yet when investigators began questioning them, they were met with a resounding wall of silence. This silence wasn't surprising to those familiar with Melbourne's criminal underworld. Witnesses feared retribution, knowing that speaking to the police could make them targets. Even those with no direct ties to Maghnie's world hesitated, afraid that any involvement could draw unwanted attention. Adding to the challenge was the underworld's unbreakable code of loyalty. Many who knew Maghnie personally or worked alongside him in illegal operations adhered to this code, refusing to cooperate with law enforcement even if it meant protecting his killers. The lack of cooperation frustrated investigators, who found themselves stuck in a loop of evasive answers and vague recollections. CCTV footage from nearby businesses provided some insights, but without witness statements to fill in the gaps, the investigation stagnated. This pervasive silence wasn't just a barrier to justice. It was a testament to the fear and influence Maghnie and his world wielded. The streets may have witnessed his murder, but they were in no hurry to give up their secrets. For Maghnie's family, his death was more than just a devastating loss. It was a harsh reckoning with the life he had led. His role as a father was deeply entwined with his identity, and despite his criminal dealings, those close to him described a man who fiercely loved and protected his children. The incident involving his daughter, a minor car accident that spiraled into an all-consuming demand for compensation, was a painful reminder of the personal stakes that often accompanied Maghnie's decisions. To his enemies, it was a minor grievance blown out of proportion. To Maghnie, it was a matter of pride and principle. In the aftermath of his murder, the family faced a barrage of questions and challenges. They grappled with conflicting emotions, anger over the violent manner of his death, fear of further retaliation, and uncertainty about what the future would hold without his imposing presence. Adding to their burden was the shadow of Maghnie's criminal legacy. While his death marked the end of his reign, it didn't erase the enemies he had made or the debts he had accrued. His family, particularly his children, were left to navigate a world that would never truly let them escape his name. For his daughter, the accident that may have set the chain of events in motion became a heavy cross to bear. Did she blame herself for her father's death, or did she see it as an inevitable consequence of the life he had chosen? In the wake of Maghnie's murder, his family faced not just grief, but a fight for survival in a world that had taken so much from them and could take even more. From the moment the investigation into Nabil Maghnie's murder began, the homicide squad knew they were facing an uphill battle. In the underworld, truth was a commodity tightly held and rarely shared. Leads were few and far between, and those that did emerge seemed to circle back to dead ends, frustrating the team's efforts to piece together what had happened on that fateful January afternoon. Every avenue explored by investigators seemed to be met with resistance. Witnesses refused to cooperate, suspects had airtight alibis, and even Maghnie's closest associates either feigned ignorance or clung to the underworld's code of silence. The homicide squad worked tirelessly, chasing down every thread of evidence: phone records, CCTV footage, ballistics reports, but none provided the breakthrough they desperately needed. The broader context of Melbourne's Gangland feuds added another layer of complexity. Maghnie's murder wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger tapestry of violence and retribution that defined the city's criminal underbelly. To crack this case, the squad would need to penetrate a world where loyalty to the code often outweighed loyalty to justice, a task that, so far, had proven nearly impossible. Even in death, Nabil Maghnie cast a long shadow. His associates, many of whom owed their status or protection to him, continued to operate as though he were still pulling the strings. His name was invoked in hushed tones with a mix of fear and reverence. To some, he was a cautionary tale. To others, he was a symbol of power and defiance. Maghnie's murder did little to disrupt the underworld operations he had helped build. Debt collections continued, disputes were settled, and alliances shifted. His death had left a void, but it was one that many seemed eager to fill, each vying for a piece of the empire he had left behind. For law enforcement, this enduring legacy posed a new challenge. Maghnie's influence extended beyond the grave, complicating their ability to dismantle the networks he had established. His associates, emboldened by his name, became more cautious, more calculated. To speak out against the Mad Leb, even posthumously, was to risk retaliation, a reality that only deepened the silence surrounding his murder. Maghnie's story wasn't just about a man, it was about the indelible mark he left on Melbourne's criminal underworld. His legacy, whether feared or respected, ensured that his presence would be felt for years to come. As months turned into years, the investigation into Nabil Maghnie's murder began to stall. The initial flurry of activity, the interviews, the evidence collection, the search for witnesses gave way to a slow and frustrating grind. Without fresh leads, the case gradually faded from the headlines, joining the growing list of unsolved gangland murders in Melbourne. For the homicide squad, the trail was maddeningly cold. Tips that had initially seemed promising turned out to be dead ends, and the few pieces of evidence they had were not enough to secure a conviction. The shadowy nature of Maghnie's world meant that even those who might have had valuable information were either unwilling or too terrified to come forward. The unsolved nature of the case wasn't just a failure for law enforcement, it was a victory for the underworld. The message was clear. Even a figure as high profile as Nabil Maghnie could be murdered in broad daylight, and the killers could walk away unscathed. As the years passed, the unanswered questions surrounding Maghnie's death continued to haunt the city. Who had orchestrated the attack? What was the true motive? And perhaps most chillingly, how many more lives would be lost before the cycle of violence was finally broken? While the official investigation may have slowed, the mystery of Nabil Maghnie's murder remained a dark and enduring chapter in Melbourne's history, a reminder of the brutal and unforgiving world he had both ruled and fallen victim to. The murder of Nabil Maghnie sent shockwaves through Melbourne's criminal underworld and beyond. For years, Maghnie had been a towering figure in the city's shadowy streets, feared, respected, and seemingly untouchable. His death shattered that illusion, leaving both his allies and rivals questioning their own safety and standing. Almost immediately, the delicate balance of power in Melbourne's underworld began to shift. Maghnie's associates scrambled to protect his interests, while rivals saw an opportunity to expand their influence. The void left by his death became a battleground for control, with tension and violence simmering just beneath the surface. Rumors of impending retaliation swept through the city, creating an atmosphere of fear and unease. For law enforcement, the chaos presented both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, the increased activity among criminal groups made it harder to track who was responsible for what. On the other, it also brought new players and potential informants into focus. Melbourne's residents, meanwhile, found themselves caught in the middle. High-profile murders like Maghnie's reminded them of the dark undercurrents that flowed through their city, a stark contrast to its vibrant, cosmopolitan image. While some hoped his death might mark the beginning of the end for the gang wars, others feared it was only the start of a new wave of bloodshed. Maghnie's murder wasn't just the end of a life. It was the beginning of a new chapter in Melbourne's criminal history, one defined by uncertainty, shifting alliances, and the ever-present threat of violence. Over the years, the theories surrounding Maghnie's murder have been as varied as the man himself. Was his death the result of a professional hit ordered by a rival gang to dismantle his influence? Or was it a personal vendetta born out of the countless enemies he had made during his reign? One prominent theory points to Maghnie's feud over his daughter's car accident. Some believe this dispute escalated to involve individuals powerful enough to orchestrate his assassination. Others argued that this incident was merely the final straw in a long history of grudges against him. Another theory focuses on internal betrayal. In the world of organized crime, trust is a precarious thing. Was Maghnie betrayed by someone within his own circle, perhaps an ally who saw his death as an opportunity to rise? The precision of the hit suggests that the killers had intimate knowledge of Maghnie's movements, knowledge that could have only come from someone close to him. Yet another line of speculation revolves around the Comanchero Bikie gang. As one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the region, they had both the motive and the means to eliminate Maghnie if he was seen as a liability. But if this were the case, why would they do so publicly, risking exposure? These theories offer tantalizing glimpses into the shadowy world Maghnie inhabited, but none have provided definitive answers. For every question answered, two more arise, leaving a tangled web of possibilities that investigators and the public alike are still trying to unravel. 5 years after his murder, the mystery of Nabil Maghnie's death remains unsolved, a dark enigma at the heart of Melbourne's underworld. Despite countless hours of investigation, dozens of theories, and endless speculation, the question lingers: who killed the Mad Leb and why? Was it a crime of passion born out of a personal vendetta that spiraled out of control? Or was it a calculated execution, meticulously planned and flawlessly executed by professionals? And what of the silence that still surrounds his death? Were the witnesses too afraid to speak out, or was their silence bought with the same currency that had defined Maghnie's life: loyalty, fear, or power? For Maghnie's family, his death remains a source of pain and uncertainty. For Melbourne's underworld, it is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most powerful are not immune to the consequences of their actions. And for the public, it is a chilling testament to the hidden world of violence and crime that exists in the city's shadows. Will the truth about Nabil Maghnie's murder ever come to light? Or will it remain one of Melbourne's greatest unsolved mysteries, a story whispered in the dark corners of its streets? Only time will tell, but for now, the questions far outweigh the answers.